You must also make amends to the villagers. Your wealth must be used to restore what has been lost. And you must turn your back on Ebuka and the cult that brought you this power. Francis's heart pounded at the mention of Ebuka. He had been the one to lead Francis into this, and Francis knew that turning on him would bring its own dangers. Ebuka won't let me walk away so easily, Francis muttered, his voice tinged with fear. The prophet's gaze was unwavering. Evil never lets go without a fight, but you have the power to choose a different path now. The question is, are you willing to fight for your redemption? Francis swallowed hard. He had no choice. If he didn't fight, he would lose everything, his soul, his life, and the village. He nodded weakly, knowing the battle ahead would be unlike any he had ever faced. The following day, Francis made his first public appearance since the prophet's revelation. He stood in the village square, trembling as the villagers gathered around him, their faces a mixture of anger, suspicion, and curiosity. He could feel their eyes boring into him, waiting for him to speak. His hands shook as he held onto the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper at first. I am sorry, he began. I have wronged this village. I let greed consume me, and in doing so, I brought suffering upon you all. I will not ask for your forgiveness yet, but I will make it right. I will give up the wealth I gained and use it to repair the damage I caused. There was a long silence before the murmurs started, but no one spoke out loud. Francis wasn't sure if they believed him or if they even cared. But he had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. That evening, Francis received a call from Ebuka. The tone of his voice sent chills down Francis's spine. I heard about your little performance today, Ebuka said, his voice cold. Do you really think you can just walk away from this? From me? Francis could hear the threat buried in Ebuka's words. I have to do this, Ebuka. The village, they are dying because of what we've done. There was a long pause, and then Ebuka's voice turned darker. If you think for a second that I'm going to let you ruin what we've built, you're a fool. I brought you into this world of power, and I can't take you out of it just as easily. Remember that. The line went dead, and Francis stared at the phone in his trembling hand. He had feared this moment, and now it was here. Ebuka wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Despite Francis's public apology, many in the village remained unconvinced. They had seen too much death and destruction to simply forgive him. Families who had lost loved ones to the mysterious accidents couldn't bear the sight of him, and whispers of vengeance began circulating. Though Francis had renounced his pact, the villagers were still afraid of what his wealth represented. One of the elders, Okoro, approached the prophet. The people are scared, he said gravely. They do not trust Francis, and they fear that the evil tied to him will linger even after his renunciation. The prophet nodded solemnly. Fear is natural, but faith is stronger. The people must learn to forgive, or the darkness will never truly leave this place. Okoro sighed, knowing that while the prophet's words were true, the road to forgiveness was long and difficult. As Francis faced mounting pressure from the villagers and the looming threat of Ebuka, he found an unexpected ally in Agnes, the elderly woman who had visited him earlier. She came to his mansion once again, her steps slow but steady. You are doing the right thing, Francis, she said quietly. But it will not be easy. Francis looked at her, surprised by her kindness. Why are you helping me? After everything I've done? Agnes smiled sadly. Because I've seen what greed and desperation can do to a person. You were not born evil, Francis. You were led astray, but now you have a chance to make things right. Her words comforted him in a way nothing else had. For the first time in weeks, Francis felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't long before Ebuka confronted Francis in person. He arrived at the mansion unannounced, his eyes cold and filled with anger. I warned you, Francis, he snarled. You think you can just walk away from the power I gave you? You're nothing without me. Francis stood his ground, though fear gripped his heart. I don't want the power anymore, Ebuka. It's destroying this village. I can't do this. Ebuka's lips curled into a menacing smile. You're a fool, Francis. You'll regret turning on me. Without another word, Ebuka turned and walked away, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud. Francis knew this was far from over. Ebuka wouldn't stop until he had taken everything from him. Francis had made his choice, but the consequences were just beginning. That night, Francis met with the prophet, his heart heavy with fear. Ebuka won't stop, Francis admitted. He's going to come after me. I don't know how to fight him. The prophet listened carefully, his face calm and thoughtful. Ebuka's power comes from darkness, and darkness can only thrive where there is fear. You must not let fear control you, Francis. But how? Francis asked, his voice desperate. How do I stand up to someone like him? The prophet placed a hand on Francis's shoulder. By standing in the light. You have chosen the path of redemption, and that gives you strength. Do not forget that you are no longer alone. The power that guides you now is greater than anything Ebuka can threaten you with. Francis nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. He only hoped the prophet's words would be enough to protect him. With the prophet's counsel fresh in his mind, Francis began to formulate a plan. He knew that confronting Ebuka directly would only lead to disaster, but he couldn't hide forever. Instead, he sought the support of the village. He met with the elders and the community leaders, explaining his intentions to use his remaining wealth to rebuild the village and make reparations to those who had suffered. Though many were still skeptical, some began to see the sincerity in Francis's actions. Slowly, a small group of villagers agreed to work with him, assisting in projects to restore homes and provide support for those affected by the tragedies. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Francis felt a small sense of relief. If he could gain the trust of even a few, perhaps he could rebuild more than just the village, he could rebuild his soul. As Francis's efforts to repair the damage in Uhuala continued, a noticeable shift began to take place. The villagers who had once looked at him with disdain now saw a man trying to make amends. While many still harbored resentment, the tangible improvements in the village softened their hearts. New roofs were built, and funds were distributed to families who had lost loved ones in the mysterious accidents. One afternoon, as Francis walked through the market, a young boy ran up to him, holding a flower. "This is for you," the boy said, smiling shyly. "My mother said you're helping fix our house." Francis took the flower, his eyes misting with emotion. It was a small gesture, but it filled his heart with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. The days following Francis's continued efforts to repair the village brought a sense of calm. Slowly, more villagers began to accept his help. The once hostile glares softened, and while forgiveness was still distant, the tension had somewhat eased. Francis could feel a small weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't fully redeemed yet, but he could see a faint glimmer of hope on the horizon. However, as the village began to heal, Francis couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond the surface. Ebuka had not made any further moves since their last confrontation, but Francis knew better than to assume he had given up. The air around him felt charged with unseen threats, and he sensed that the storm was about to break. Late one night, as Francis lay in bed, he was awoken by a sharp noise. He sat up, his heart pounding. The mansion was eerily silent, but something felt off. He tiptoed downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. When he reached the living room, the faint scent of burning incense filled the air, a smell that immediately reminded him of his initiation into the cult. Francis's blood ran cold. He could feel Ebuka's presence, though the man himself was nowhere to be seen. A voice echoed through the room, low and sinister. "You can try to redeem yourself, Francis, but you belong to me now. I will never let you go." The voice sent chills down Francis's spine. He dropped to his knees, trembling in the darkness. Ebuka's power was far greater than he had imagined, and now it was clear, his former friend was preparing to strike. Terrified by Ebuka's growing power, Francis sought the prophet's guidance once more. He arrived at the prophet's house, visibly shaking. "He's still here," Francis said, his voice trembling. "Ebuka, he won't let me go. I can feel him in my home, in the air. He's planning something, I know it." The prophet listened calmly, his face grave. "Ebuka has tied his soul to darkness. His power comes from a source that thrives on fear, and he will use every trick to keep you bound." Francis buried his face in his hands. "What do I do? I don't know how to fight him. He's too strong." The prophet reached out and placed his hand on Francis's shoulder. "There is one thing that can break the darkness, Francis. You must seek divine intervention. Only the power of God can sever the ties that bind you to Ebuka and the cult. We must pray, and we must do so with unwavering faith." Francis nodded, though fear still gnawed at him. He had renounced the darkness, but would God truly deliver him from the evil that haunted him? The prophet organized a special prayer meeting for the entire village. He gathered the elders, community leaders, and as many villagers as he could to join in collective prayer for the deliverance of Uhuala from the evil that had plagued it. It was a gathering unlike anything the village had ever seen. Hundreds of people gathered in the open square, their faces somber and hopeful. As the prayers began, Francis felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. The prophet led the congregation in powerful words of faith and deliverance, calling upon divine power to break the curse that had befallen the village. Francis joined in, his voice rising with the others. For the first time in a long while, he felt something greater than fear. He felt hope. Just as the prayers reached a fever pitch, a sudden gust of wind swept through the square, extinguishing the candles that had been lit. The air grew cold, and a sinister laugh echoed through the darkness. The villagers gasped as they felt an oppressive presence settle over them. Francis knew without a doubt that it was Ebuka. His presence was like a thick fog, suffocating the very air around them. The prophet stepped forward, his voice strong and unyielding. "Do not fear this darkness. It has no power over the light of God." But the wind grew stronger, and the villagers began to panic. Some ran for cover, while others huddled together, their prayers faltering. Francis stood frozen, his heart racing as the storm raged around him. Ebuka's voice cut through the chaos, mocking and cruel. "You cannot defeat me, Francis. You will never be free."